Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Reporter Night series here at Columbia University. My name is Steve Cohen. I'm a professor here at Columbia University and the Senior Vice Dean of Columbia School of Professional Studies. I direct an MPA program in Environmental Science and Policy and a MS program in Sustainability Management. And welcome to everybody here tonight. I want to first thank Claudia Dreyfuss, our very own Columbia professor and contributor to the New York Review of Books. Claudia put this virtual event together for her students, but also for the broader Columbia community. She's an outstanding member of our faculty and teaches both at the School of International Public Affairs and in the Sustainability Management program, which is a joint program of Columbia's School of Professional Studies and our Climate School. She teaches a wonderful course entitled Writing About Global Science for the International Media. Today, Claudia will be interviewing a panel of top science editors and reporters on their career paths, as well as the highlights of the challenges of their day-to-day work. She'll introduce each of them to you, and I won't do that in her place, but I just wanted to mention that the field that we're talking about tonight is critical. The importance of science communication for decision-making is important in the climate crisis, it's important in the COVID crisis, and it's important because many of the people who make decisions in our world are scientific illiterates. And so it really makes the burden for Claudia and the people you're going to hear tonight that much more difficult. And so this evening, I want to welcome this esteemed panel of journalists to provide their perspectives on the challenge of science journalism in this era of anti-science. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Claudia Dreifus. Claudia.
Thank you, Dean Cohen, and thank you for all your support of our course. And welcome to the current students in writing about global science for the international media. Welcome to our alumni from the Masters of Sustainability Management program, and to our friends from the science journalism community, and also to our speakers. Thank you all for coming. Tonight, is the highlight of every semester that we have in the Sustainability Management program, because this is our chance to talk to professionals about what they do and how they do it. And most years we chat with the editors at some on-campus venue, and then we dash off to that pizzeria across from St. John's Cathedral, and we drink lots of bad wine and eat lots of fattening food and have more in-person talk. I hope if all goes well in the world, and if a certain coronavirus doesn't mutate any more than it has, we'll be able to do this in person this summer and in the fall editions of this class. Fingers crossed, candles lit, let's hope. It's that coronavirus that's the center of some of what we're going to talk about tonight, because as we all know, until Russia invaded Ukraine last month, this was the major science story of our time. For once, science was on the front page every day, and people really thought about science as they hadn't before, as they took it for granted before. And for those of us who cover science, who love science, this pandemic has been a left-handed joy. We want it to be relevant, but not at the cost of nearly 1 million American lives and countless more internationally. So tonight we're going to ask how this pandemic has changed science journalism. That's going to be the heart of our conversation. We're going to welcome your questions, and you can send them in, and we will try to ask as many as we can. We've got a lot of work to do in a small amount of time. And then we will also talk a little about the biography of our speakers and ask questions related to COVID. We'll do that until 7:30. That's when the students from our class will be speaking to our guests in what's called a virtual green room. Thank you to Denise Abad and the team, the tech team from SPS, for helping us get this all together. Guests, I thank you all for coming. Speakers, we're so grateful for your time and your ideas. So let me introduce them. First of all, Rick Berke, from Boston, is the co-founder and executive editor of Stat News, which, as you know, covers science, health, and biotech. Before starting at Stat, Rick was a distinguished New York Times correspondent and editor, and he also edited an early edition of Politico. Stat News, which is published by the owner of the Boston Globe, has been a major player in covering COVID. So, Rick, I've told some of your CV. How have you been covering COVID differently? And did you ever think that your career would come to this place? Tell us a little how you got started.
Well, I was as thanks for having me, Claudia. It's good to see everyone, and I feel a close. I went to the Columbia Journalism School, so I feel a certain closeness to Columbia. And I'm actually in New York right now for our own Stat event tomorrow. But I wish I could be there in person and go have pizza with you all. So in terms of my career, just very briefly, I was. You mentioned New York Times. I spent most of my career, 28 years at the Times, as the chief political correspondent, as an assistant managing editor, a lot of different roles. I didn't have a particular health or science background or interest, frankly. And I was approached about 7 years ago by John Rennie, who had bought the Boston Globe, who was looking to sort of establish a national, international publication that covered health and medicine. And his interest was that we're in Boston, the epicenter of health and medicine in many ways, hospitals, biotech, but it's more than a regional publication. He said there's an international story of international interest here. So I moved to Boston. I was just intrigued by the idea of building a brand new news organization. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw all these science stories that weren't being covered anywhere. Like I started just asking basic dumb questions of a non-scientist about explain this, explain that, and they're amazing stories to tell. So we built Stat, and then we were moving along really well, and then COVID hit, and there was never a choice of should we cover COVID or how do we cover COVID. It was just a natural progression for us because we already had reporters covering infectious diseases. We had reporters covering vaccines. We had reporters covering drug development. So it just was sort of all in our wheelhouse by the time COVID happened. We certainly didn't expect this or anything of this scale. And it's still hard to sort of absorb for, I think, all of us. But it sort of was a natural progression once we started Stat to sort of go right into covering COVID and the consequences. And just one last thing you asked about sort of the challenges. I think the challenges for Stat were sort of to pick our shots and to write not the commodity stories that everyone else was doing, but to write the stories that could really break through and sort of speak with authority about what we saw going on in this unfolding pandemic. And we were able to draw from, the other thing I've sort of learned is these stories are, as my fellow panelists all know, they're complicated, they're tough. You can't just throw a reporter very easily on covering a pandemic. I mean, you can, especially when you look at the vaccines and the drug development, this is complicated stuff. So we benefited from having reporters who had years of suddenly all these stories that they'd covered for years that no one really cared about, that were sort of felt off to the side. Suddenly they were front and center.
Yeah, it was very much like 42nd Street. Go out there and do Ruby Keeler and come back a star. And let's talk a little more about that later, but let's meet John Rennie, the deputy editor of the prize-winning internet magazine about physics, biology, and math, Quanta. Before joining Quanta, he'd been editor of Scientific American. And let me just say that John has been my editor on stories I've done for them. And I have to say, he's brilliant. I mean, good editors are unmatchable, and he is one of the smartest people I've ever met. Welcome, John.
Well, that is, as always, an introduction I cannot possibly live up to, but thank you very much. Yeah, no, I really appreciate getting to be here with so many colleagues who are also genuinely my friends here tonight. And I include you in that grouping, Claudia. Thank you. So yeah, so I mean, to addressing the questions of the hour here, I'll start with myself, as I so often do. I mean, and so it's how I managed to do all of these kinds of things. This is the difficulty of, I think, in some ways, for someone like myself as a rapidly graying eminence to be trying to offer some kind of career advice to people getting started, because the reality is, let's face it, that the science journalism world in which I came up was very, very different from the one that faces people today. The primary big thing that made it possible for me to get into a lot of these places and to learn enough to be able to progress the way that I did was I was able to take advantage of, first, being born phenomenally lucky, which is hard for you to reproduce entirely on your own. Second, just working really hard, more reproducible, but also saying yes to a lot of things along the way. And none of that would have really been possible if it weren't also for a lot of terrific mentorship that I'd had along the way. So I would say, insofar as it's possible for you, whether you manage to be get a staff position someplace, whether you are on internships, even in the dealings that you may have with editors or copy editors or fact checkers, and whatever capacity that you are dealing with people, you can learn a lot from them and try to absorb that in a really strong spirit of internalizing those things and getting better. That made a huge difference for me. I was very, very lucky to be able to have some great editors along the way who did a lot to pull me along and make me much better than I was. And that's always the sort of advice that I would genuinely offer to anyone who's really looking to try to come along and do a lot of things. Use other people, and also tap into the kind of passions that you've genuinely got for telling stories and also for the science. If you don't have both of that, this may not be the thing for you in the long run. In terms of how I managed to bring sort of the interest in passion for telling stories and also for science to the whole issue of the coverage of the pandemic for Quanta, I think the challenge for us was in part that, as you said, the pandemic has been the most covered story in the world. So one of the challenges is always to find, how do you find a different story that everyone else isn't already telling? Something that actually helped us at Quanta is the fact that Quanta, our concern is very much one of trying specifically to follow important, interesting advances in fundamental science, in physical sciences and life sciences and computer science and mathematics in particular. So for us, it was less necessary for us to be able to follow a lot of the ins and outs of exactly what was happening with the specifics of the pandemic in terms of the numbers of people who are falling to it, or the availability of vaccines, for example, as much as it was to pay attention to more of the background underlying science and how the changes that were going on in that. So for example, we've done a lot to try to cover some of how the epidemiology works, sometimes in a spirit of different kinds of explainers, but also sometimes to be able to get across certain kinds of nuances of why it was you couldn't necessarily count on something like herd immunity to get you out of a problem like this. We also have one of our staff writers, the wonderful Jorgensen Pelowitz, did a huge feature for us in which he looked at the issue of epidemiological modeling, because this was, after all, the field that everyone in the world was looking to for some sort of guidance of what should we do. And the stories that she was able to turn up and tell on across a genuinely global scale this way was one of trying to capture both the spirit of what was it like for these researchers who suddenly had everyone in the world looking to them at a time when they were also suddenly discovering that the kinds of projections that come out of epidemiology are not necessarily what people want to hear. And that indeed, a lot of the epidemiology itself, as they developed the science, was not up to being able to cover this kind of pandemic in the moment as usefully as people would have liked. Those were the ways that the sort of the natural way for us to approach this subject. And in the course of that, it was then some kinds of unique stories came out of that.
Very interesting. On that epidemiology question, one of my current students for her term project is following around an epidemiologist who chases after feral cats and collects their scat.
Yeah.
Great story, and if
Absolutely.
anyone's interested. At any rate, she's the scat chaser, the scat cat chaser. So let us continue and welcome a newcomer to the science publishing world, Dr. Eva Kiesler. I'm thinking of our friend Elizabeth Colbert. Dr. Eva Kiesler, who is a research scientist at Rockefeller here in New York. And she's also the editor of Rockefeller's new magazine, which is called SEEK. How did you become a writer, editor, publisher? Eva, hello. We're on. Can you hear me?
Sorry, now
don't
I'm
hear
muted. That would be better.
Yeah.
So I had no formal training in journalism at all. I trained in science, as Claudia says, and I guess the irony is I always wanted to write. I felt a bit like an imposter working in science, although I did like it a lot. And I asked myself many times, I should probably be in journalism school, but somehow that seemed very scary. So doing a PhD seemed easier, so I just did that. And to make a long story short, at one point, I was in New York. I was doing my postdoctoral work, and it wasn't going very well. And I had to face up with the fact that I didn't actually want to become a scientist at all. I couldn't really be a reporter at that point because, I was from a different country. I was here on a visa. I couldn't freelance. I needed a job. I needed an organization to sponsor me on a visa. So I started working in communications. Most research institutions or universities would have a communications department that creates content for the public-facing website, for publications and newsletters and things like that. And so I did that. I worked mainly as a science writer and an editor, and I really loved it. I still do. I have to say, I really liked that I was still able to be part of a scientific community. The scientists would have been my colleagues. I would go and meet with them in their labs and learn about what they were doing. But then I didn't have to do the experiments, what I consider the boring part, but I got to tell stories and get paid for it. So that was great. Initially in my first job, I was still writing for fairly, audiences with fairly high expertise, I would say, academics and biotech and so on. But the longer I worked in this field, the more I was drawn to writing for mixed audiences, and especially, trying to get the message across to people who may not have any connection to science or any reason to any, obvious interest in it. And I've always felt that that's the work I like the most. When we tell a story about science, we obviously want it to be acceptable or impressive to the scientists, that we want the expert to be satisfied with it, but we also want to motivate the reader who doesn't have the interest. So I think many times it's a trick about charming the reader as much as we can, and as John said, use all the enthusiasm and interest we have and we can muster. So anyway,
tell us a little bit about SEEK, if you would.
Oh yes, so when I
have a picture of SEEK that we can put up on the screen.
Put up
there it is.
Magazine. So
hey, the baby.
Yes, that's the baby. So work at the Rockefeller University now, and when I interviewed for the job, they had decided that the university should have a magazine. They hadn't decided what it would be exactly or what it would do. So they asked me, could I come up with content to fill a magazine? I said, twist my arm, sure. That's, that sounds great. So it was really a lot of fun. We had a budget, we had more or less a blank slate. And what we wanted to do was create a magazine that would not only talk about scientific discoveries and how they solve medical problems, but that would really tell a bigger picture about the process of science. What does doing the pursuit of science look like behind the curtain, so to speak? So who are the people doing the science? What ideas are driving them? What conversations drive them? And so that's what we did. And
do you take freelance work?
We do. Yes.
You do. Well, I think you may hear from some people.
I hope so.
Let's go on, but let's get back to you, because there is another scientist who's gone literary on our panel, and he is John Timmer, the editor of Ars Technica, the magazine that Condé Nast puts out. And let me say that according to the New York Times today, you've gone union. Go Solidarity. Don't mourn for us, organize.
Well, I'm on the management side, so I'm on the evil end of the spectrum. So in terms of how I ended up there, I am basically Eva without the visa issues. I was trying to become a scientist at one point in my career, and I made it as far as non-tenure track faculty, and it was just this constant grind of looking for money in lab space all the time. And I just decided it was this, my childhood dream of being a scientist did not look like this. And so I spent about a year trying 4 or 5 different alternate careers in freelance mode, and the thing that worked out was writing for Ars Technica, and I'm still in the very first real job I've had outside of the lab, probably about 15 years later. At the time, Ars Technica was basically a blog host, and that allowed me a lot of space to learn what I was doing as they professionalized. And so I was very lucky in that regard to sort of get in on the curve where my skill level and their demands were reasonably in sync. And, over the years, just through practice, I've figured out what I'm doing more or less in terms of journalism. And, we've grown since then. I'm now managing full-time staff and a large group of freelancers. And when that isn't sucking up all my time, I write myself as well.
Well, a happy story. I think there are probably a lot of researchers who might like to make that transition. We get them in my class every now and then too. So science, the doing of science is not for everyone, but there are many people who love it anyway. And journalism is the answer for them. Speaking of solidarity, Rodrigo Perez Ortega is a staff writer for Science Magazine, which is the venerable journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. But they also cover science in addition to printing papers and the results of experiments. And his particular beat, which is very interesting and very important, is both diversity and how the global South is being covered and experiences scientific change. How did this beat develop for you, Mr. Perez?
Hi, Claudia. Thank you for the invitation. I guess for me, it was just, I was very young, fresh out of grad school when I started doing the internship.
May I
route.
interrupt you and tell everyone that you went to the University of California at Santa Cruz, which has an
Yes.
excellent science journalism program.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I did undergrad at UNAM in Mexico City, and then towards the end of my undergrad, I realized that I wanted to do science writing, and it was actually in the U.S. that attending AAAS and other conferences and meeting other science writers that I realized it was a thing that people did as a job, and I thought it was really cool. And that's why I decided to go to grad school in UC Santa Cruz, as you say, which is an excellent program, basically to train scientists as journalists. The science, how publication works, funding, and they focus on turning scientists into journalists. And so that's what I did. And then I moved to DC to do the internship rounds, and that's how I joined Science as an intern in January of 2020, so right when the pandemic hit. And it was very, very interesting to see how this excellent newsroom. I remember my first editorial meeting. Martin, my editor, he was annoyed that China was not revealing information about this new weird pneumonia disease, and that's how it all started. So it was very interesting to see from the inside how excellent journalists, John Cohen, Martin Enstring, Kai Kafferschmidt, quickly jumped into the coverage of that. And they were the experts covering the virus itself, but I think the newsroom as a whole, including me, jumped on how the pandemic affected science in general. So there was suddenly a plethora of stories. One of my first stories was how the pandemic was affecting the mental health of healthcare workers. Not a lot of papers or research was being done about that other than anecdotes. And suddenly the preprints started coming out, so it was also all these stories about that changed science, policy, publishing, there was a lot of problems with funding. And I think me coming from Latin America, I really tried to get stories what was going on in Latin America from the pandemic, or the global South in general. There was, a lot of misinformation with ivermectin, for example, that was not happening in the US or in Europe. And that was kind of like, hey guys, this is going on here, It was also stories about, last year we did a story about one of the first court cases in Peru. There were, it was something to do with the government spending a lot of money on COVID testing, and there was like a court case, and it was so interesting to watch that it was kind of like the first court cases that involved a lot of science, and just the prosecutors didn't get it. So there were actual scientists, being witnesses, and that was also interesting. So I think for me, it was more of the not covering the virus per se, but how the virus affected the whole community in, before and after that. So it's been quite a learning curve. And one of the things that happened during the, that summer was this social justice reckoning all over the world, especially in the US. And that's how I guess a lot of attention was put into that in general, in all science and science journalism. And that's how I also became interested in, covering social injustice and diversity in science in general. And then I finished my internship at Science and went to work with Johnny, with John in Quanta, which was also really interesting because, again, I remember one story with it, like John said, not specifically like breaking news, but it was just, this wild idea of doing this self-disseminating vaccines for wildlife. It's one of those Quanta stories that go to the fundamentals. And it was just another angle of the pandemic. So thanks, John, for that great time and also mentoring that you mentioned, Claudia. And yeah, so then I went back freelancing to Mexico City, and I guess that importance of diversity was what convinced the editors at Science to ask me to join them again as staff writer. and develop this beat, like you say, just shining light of all historic and systemic failures, I guess, and what people are doing right now, which I think is very interesting, what people are doing right now to change that at all levels, you know, whether it's health disparities, whether it's inequalities in gender inequality or racial inequalities in science itself, funding, and all these kind of things that I think everyone wants to change or make better, but sometimes are a little bit clueless on how to do it. So it's been quite interesting developing this new bit that of course dovetails with all the inequalities that we saw during and still the pandemic.
Well, let's get back to some of that later, but we still need to talk to two more guests. And our next guest is the Brooke Borel. Brooke? She is a professor of journalism at NYU's very fine science journalism program. She is also the articles editor of UNDARK, which is an excellent internet magazine doing remarkable muckraking out of MIT. And she is also the author of, I don't know if you can see this, but it's the author of a book called Infested, about bed bugs. I hope you made a lot of money on this. Not that
I
anyone
wish,
makes,
not really.
yeah, that's what happens with books. But ouch, it makes one itchy just to talk about it. In any case, how did you get into this racket, and how did you find your book subject?
Oh yeah, well, thanks for having me. I was forgetting that I had to talk because I was so enjoying hearing everyone else's story. I did not go to journalism school. I started out as an undergrad studying biomedical engineering. I finished that degree, but it was not really my passion. And I spent several years trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to do. I always loved writing, and I ended up in a program at NYU. I didn't know that science journalism was a thing. And I ended up in this other program at NYU, a master's program that was sort of a build your own adventure program, basically. And I intended actually to build a program to write fiction. But there was some coursework related to science studies and history of science and that sort of thing that I kept gravitating towards because I always really did love science. And I ended up instead crafting my master's around writing about science. And after I finished that, I wanted to continue writing about science, and I kind of, through some lucky conversations with friends of friends, met someone who was a science journalist and had never realized that was a career that you could have. And I tried for some internships. I was not really a classic intern. I kind of struggled to find an internship, but ultimately found one, a brief one. And then my first paid job, probably the most important step in my early career, was that I got a job as a fact checker, very luckily. For someone who has not gone to journalism school, or even for someone who has, but for someone who needs a crash course in journalism, working as a fact checker really teaches you how stories are put together, sometimes really well and sometimes very poorly, how journalists do their research and how it can be better. So I learned a lot on that job about fact checking and about editing, and also had to do some writing there as well. That particular magazine was a magazine called Science Illustrated, which I'm pretty sure does not exist, at least in English anymore. It's a weird magazine. I shouldn't say it's a weird magazine. It's a magazine that's originally published in Danish, and they were trying to translate it for an American audience for a while. At the time, it was owned by the same publisher, a former publisher of Popular Science. Of course, that title has been sold a couple times since then. And I was in the same office as the Pop Sci editors, and I started pitching stories to them and getting some freelance assignments. And then I got laid off as a fact checker, but that's okay. And I was a freelance writer, a freelance journalist for about 10 years, just really grinding away, trying to get as much work as possible to pay the bills. During that time is when I wrote Infested, which was the book about bed bugs. I also wrote another book called The Chicago Guide to Fact Checking it's a guide for journalism students and others too who are interested in learning that craft, because that is something that is not always taught specifically in journalism school. Of course, journalism school professors teach verification and teach how to report, but this sort of role of a separate person doing fact checking isn't always part of every single newsroom, and it's not something that is always necessarily taught. So this was a book trying to sort of bring that that kind of job out of newsrooms that do use it into the hands of people who might not otherwise get to experience
I am
it.
going to put it on my syllabus.
Great. And actually, I have a second edition coming out, and it's due tomorrow to my publisher. So after we talk tonight, I will be finishing up working on book edits.
What a useful book. And I am going to put it on the syllabus. But I must ask, I can't resist. How did the bedbug book start? Was there an incident?
Yeah, well, I had that. I mean, I live in New York. Well, right now I live up in Greene County in the Catskills, but I lived in New York City for 18 years, and I had bed bugs a couple times, and I was working as a science reporter. And I mean, really the idea for that book came from some interviews I was doing for an article that I was working on. And some of the stuff that the scientists were telling me during the interviews were just really fascinating. And I kind of wanted to read a history, and sort of a book that captured the things that they were telling me. And I asked them for a recommendation, and they said there is no such book. And I said, all right. And so I decided to try and write it.
So this is the perfect example of write what you know, as they say at countless writers' conferences. We'll get back to you, Brooke, but let's talk to David Sassoon, the founder of a publication that many of people out there listening to this will really care about, because we have a lot of students from the climate school, the new Columbia Climate School, and David Sassoon edits Inside Climate School. I am tongue-tied. Inside Climate News, and something that we read every day it comes out. It is an internet magazine. And how did this start?
Yeah, so a lot of what happened to me is accident, and I'm not sure I'm equipped to give any career advice except to follow what you think you need to do and follow your passion. I started out as a photographer. When I was 22 years old, I saved some money. I put my Leicas and developer and a tank for developing negatives into a backpack, and I started traveling around the world. I ended up in Kathmandu, where I spent 4 years running around the Himalayas, which I loved. I do have a passion for the outdoors and the environment. And it was there that I applied, from there that I applied to the journalism school at Columbia, got in, put down my cameras, and I guess started on what you might call a career. One thing that was enormously valuable about doing something like that I didn't really predict is being immersed in another place, because when you get back, you see the cast of characters that struts across the stage, and you see the society you live in with fresh eyes, and it never quite goes away. So let me fast forward. I mean, I graduated from Columbia in 1985. Fast forward to 2005, say about 20 years. I had tried a lot of things. None of them made me happy. And I started doing some contract writing around the question of climate change for some foundations. And I got hooked. I went to the IPCC conference in Montreal in 2004. It was actually a time when the corporations and the business sector believed they could save a lot of money by reducing energy consumption and solve the climate problem, and they were bragging about it. And I was coming at it actually as a bit of a business story. not so much a science story, not so much a green story, but a business story. And I thought, oh, this is, the corporations are behind this. There's talk in Congress and so on. So I started a publication that I thought everybody would want to read right away. And I was quite wrong about that. It's taken a long time, but it started as an experiment. One of the funders I was doing some writing for gave us $150,000, and we started. And we didn't have a business plan. We knew we wanted to model good environmental journalism around the climate story, which was riddled with all kinds of false balance. So we thought, okay, if we can start to pull in a slightly different direction, change the narrative, maybe we can get somewhere. And then we got some breaks. Reuters started picking up our stuff. There was a time when all these blogs were out there and the mainstream was concerned about them, and they started bringing them in. So there was a time when we would publish a story and it would appear on the Reuters website with a Reuters URL. And that was really our first break. And it was one break after another. A lot of hard work, a lot of wonderful people I convinced to work for us for almost no money. The life of an entrepreneur. It was a lot of fun. We are now 25 people. We started with 2. It's been 15 years. I was 50 years old when I started it. So late in my life, I found my bliss, you might say. This thing that I love to do. I love that we've created these jobs in environmental journalism, which is on the ropes, as so many other things in journalism are. We're covering a very important subject 24/7 in a very aggressive way, and we do all kinds of things on our website. Those of you who are familiar with our work, a lot of accountability work, some solutions, some science, some very specific beats around agriculture or short-lived climate pollutants. We hired a reporter last year that is covering this arena called Rights of Nature, which is fascinating and really, really interesting. So it's just an exciting place to be. And I also highly recommend nonprofit journalism. I think there's a lot of independence there, even though you don't have the resources you might have elsewhere. You know, with UNDARK, Brooke, I mean, we did a great project with you guys last year on ecocide. And, you know, we pulled the pieces together and pulled together a 9-part series, or really ambitious. So that's our story. I mean, I rambled a bit all over the place, but I hope that gives a picture of what we've done. And it's not really a case study that would do well in an MBA program or anything like that.
So let me ask you the money question. Do you take freelance work? My students want to know.
We absolutely do. You know, we do. We have a staff, but we also need freelancers, and it really is you know, the quality of the ideas.
So let me go to the topic of the evening, the pandemic. How has your work and your life changed, but particularly your beats because of it? I mean, let's face it, science journalism pre-2020 was a very specialized field for people who really were interested. Few newspapers had a science desk. There were only, I would say, the 3 major newspapers were among the only ones. And it just was an area of limited interest. And the people who were often covering it on the news desk were not scientifically literate or particularly interested. So bam, comes January 2020, and it's a different story. We're now the front of the game. Was that a good feeling? And what did you do with it? John Rennie was telling us you were covering aspects of the basic science, but were you ready for this moment? Rick? You were.
Yeah, I would say we were, just because we happened to have the right people in place. And one of the things, and let me just say, I'm so impressed by all the panelists. All these publications are so well respected, and they're many role models for what I see as sort of great science reporting. We were ready partly because, unlike the rest of you, I didn't have a science background. So my first initiative was to hire the most authoritative reporters I could find anywhere to come help me start STAT. I had a general feeling that I thought some science reporting was a little slow. And even when I was at the New York Times, I thought sometimes we could move faster. And so I knew I wanted to move faster and be more provocative in our coverage. Yet I also thought, this is complicated stuff, so we can't make any mistakes. We got to be careful. So I hired very sort of instantly credible people. So if you sort of fast forward to the pandemic, we were ready to go when that happened, and sort of front and center. And suddenly, as you were saying earlier, we went from in early 20, I think in January 2020, we had about 1.5 million unique visitors. And then in March of 2020, it went up to 26 million. And it was a really good feeling. Not that we were looking for, STAT has always been looking for sort of quality, not quantity. But so we weren't like looking for a huge scale, but it was a nice feeling during this horrible time that people had a place they could go for trustworthy journalism, where people like our lead COVID reporter, Helen Branswell, I mean, she spent years building sources in that world. So she knew exactly who to talk to and who not to talk to. And she and our other reporters, as I'm sure everyone here, would get deluged by people wanting to be quoted, people purported experts who maybe had, some kind of, doctor before their name, who pretended they knew something about an infectious disease when they really didn't. So you really needed—
Send them to MSNBC instead.
Right. So you really need people who know, who bring credibility. And I think that's something that's happened in, I think it's a good thing for science journalism since COVID, is people see the value and the import of what we're all doing, and that it's not easy stuff, and it takes work, and it's complicated. And I look at some of these stories that just, again, I think about when I think about other crises, I think about 9/11 when I was at the Times, and we throw 1 million people on covering 9/11, and certain stories sort of any great reporter can do, but on something like a pandemic, you need that expertise. I think you can't just learn it on the fly.
Yeah, let me throw a question out to whoever wants to answer this. But Carol Morton, who was perhaps she still is, has sent a question and echoes something I'm thinking. She had been a public affairs officer at Harvard for many years, and she asks, is the role of science journalism to promote science? Are there aspects underlying the anti-science movement that expose problems to science journalists? I would amend that to ask, were you shocked by the degree of anti-science that quickly emerged in society?
Yeah,
I don't think that it emerged that quickly. I think that we've seen this for a very long time when it comes to anti-vaxxers or people who are vaccine skeptics or what have you. And we've been having a huge amount of issues with disinformation and misinformation for a long time now, that especially started building after the 2016 election. So it actually isn't surprising to me at all that we're dealing with this sort of anti-science or whatever you want to call it now with the pandemic.
So you're saying that leadership at the top was anti-science and it quickly filtered down?
Well, I think that there's a sea of a lot of people out there that want to spread mis and disinformation, and a pandemic is one of many perfect times to contribute to that sea of mis and disinformation. I don't think any of that was necessarily new. I think the pandemic was just another opportunity for all of that.
I strongly agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look back in the 1920s, you see this anti-evolution propaganda that mirrors exactly what you're still hearing today. So there's this long history of anti-science in the US, and it's just a matter of people deciding when it's advantageous for political or business or social reasons to tap into the techniques and the populations that are already out there.
I would agree. The misinformation has a long and distinguished history here. We were looking at the 1950s smog in California, and there was the playbook repeats itself. And we've been operating in the climate world and, battling misinformation for a very long time. And it's just an extension and a heightening of those tendencies and those powers, I think.
I think so. I absolutely, of course, agree with all of that. I think the interesting thing that this is represented, in a sense, it's all part of the challenge of covering what's been going on with the pandemic. A certain level of, in our case at least, a certain level of the opportunity that arose for that was that it meant that there was that much more interest or much room to try to do stories that were based on how do we understand the things that we understand? What is the basis for the foundation for the scientific knowledge and the confidence that the scientists are able to bring to this? But I think, and just to speak though to this other point about what Carol Morton was talking about, Claudia, and what you were talking about, is that the tricky thing, and this has shown up in a lot of other issues, certainly in coverage of climate, certainly in covers about the debates about teaching evolution in classrooms and so forth, is that formally as journalists, you get it put in your head that you are supposed to be in a certain sort of position of being nonpartisan, of not taking a side. And yet when I think, in an issue like this, it is very hard not to be in the situation of having to rebut what you know to be untruths or misinformation, and not to in effect be in the situation of what will be seen as having taken the scientist side. And I think it's an interesting question of that. I think as science journalists, I think it's a little disingenuous for us, for the most part. I'm sure there are exceptions, but I think that for the most part, a lot of it's a little disingenuous to say that we are agnostic on the subject of science. I think that most of us do approach the idea that there is fundamentally, we believe in the value of science as an enterprise, at the same time that we may see a lot of particular things that desperately need to be corrected, or problems that are pointed out along the way. In the same way that you can be a patriot, and one of the most patriotic things that you can possibly do is point out what you might think that your country is doing wrong. I think that sometimes it's uncomfortable for a lot of journalists to be in the situation of feeling like they have to get up every day and defend the scientists because they feel like they are not supposed to be in a situation of seemingly picking one side in a fight. But when the other side in that fight is just telling untruths, spreading misinformation, and the cost is watching millions of people die, I think it's not hard for some of us to decide what we have to do in the morning.
Claudia,
I
I'm sorry.
go ahead, Rick.
No, I was just going to respectfully disagree with everyone, because I think, with the caveat that you all have much more of a science background in history than I do, but I have a perspective of covering politics and government for a long time. And I do think, and I don't doubt there's been a history and there's disinformation and propaganda for a long time, but I really think that this pandemic was a turning point where I've never seen so much mistrust of our scientific institutions and leadership. I've never seen, the president's science advisors questioned in the way they have been. I've just never seen anything at this level whatsoever. And I would also say, I mean, presidents have always trusted the whole idea of what we saw Trump not trusting the science advisors. I've never seen anything quite like that. How many presidents did we, whether you like Fauci or not, how many presidents did you see him serve over decades where there were never questions about his sort of scientific expertise or his ethical, perspective? So I do think, from my point of view, this was a turning point, and I think a lot of reporters that I work with would say this is the biggest shock to them that of this pandemic, that the fake science out there and the false narratives and the bad information out there.
I am now waiting for David to correct you on this.
Yes.
Let me just say that Rick, I agree with you in terms of intensity and scale, but this didn't come out of nowhere. You can follow this, and it exploded when certain conditions and certain people were making it happen in a certain way. And you look at COVID, you look at election results, you look at anything you find inconvenient, the techniques are now available to everybody to overturn our faith in any kind of fact.
Let me interrupt
it's a
at this
larger
point
problem.
and throw out the question that somebody was talking about the 1920s. Well, what's different now is that a third of the population has gone to college, and yet we're seeing large parts of the population taking cattle deworming for a pandemic.
I think a large part of that is because we now have the internet and we have people that are able to connect with, conspiracy theories or whatever in different ways than ever before. Also, unfortunately, one thing that we have seen is that some of these issues have become increasingly partisan too. So, the fact that people are informed or educated actually doesn't have much to do with their acceptance of science, at least as I understand sort of the research behind science communication these days. People used to think that there's this thing called the deficit model where all we have to do is inform people. And if we tell them how the science works, then they'll get it and it's all going to be fine. And I don't think that that's how the research is sort of ended up. Like, you can have someone who's highly educated, who's gone to college, who's taken science classes, and depending on their political leanings, depending on the friends they have, their family, the people that they listen to, they may fall prey to mis and disinformation and conspiracy theory, even if they are educated at this point.
Could I riff off that a second?
Please.
One thing that's very apparent if you listen to the people who would typically get labeled anti-science is they actually respect science. They talk about doing your own research. They talk about the things they accept as evidence. They have a respect for science. They just don't know how it functions well enough to do it themselves. And so they latch on to this distorted version. But the fact that they're talking about evidence, they're talking about research, means that they still think evidence is important. They just don't have the filters to assess the credibility of what they consider evidence.
And that's where journalism comes in.
In theory.
In theory, we're supposed to provide the information that permits people to make good decisions. What's gone wrong?
Well, I think in
Yes.
Latin America, for example, I mean, moving on to the global south, we really noticed a lack of training in science journalism. You know, we knew each other, but we were all scattered, and we didn't really talk to each other. And suddenly the pandemic hit, and there was a hunger for science journalists everywhere. And one of the thing that we had to do, you know, on like a Mexican network science journalists, which is kind of like the equivalent of the National Association of Science Writers in the US, was provide training to journalists who were not getting the science right. You know, everything from like how to read a paper, what is a preprint, how does a vaccine work, and I think that was a heavy lifting on our part. But it also, one of the silver linings is that it really solidified the networks. You know, suddenly journalists who were, you know, working for competitors, they were talking to each other, and you know, they were respecting each other, but also sharing information, sharing sources, and especially, you know, something that was mentioned, you know, all these quackers or researchers who didn't even know what a virus was, you know. So it was just kind of like trying to help other reporters, you know, give sources that were trustworthy, information, training. And I think that was a really silver lining in terms of advancing science journalism, or journalism in general, towards a more, you know, authoritative place of fact-checking, you know, getting things right, and also not being afraid of saying we don't know yet, but this is what's going on. And I think that was also kind of like a realization, but also a very nice, I guess, benefit that I don't, you know, especially in the global south, would have taken years to achieve. So I see that as a really good bright side in the darkness, I guess.
If I can slightly disagree with a point that John Timber was making on this, is that I would agree that there is, when we talk to the people, a lot of the people who are, as you say, the people who seem like they're anti-science, that this seems like there's an underlying level of respect that is there. Where I think that what you were describing might go slightly astray is that I'm not sure that the way I think what you were describing was itself also a small variation on a sort of the deficit model error mistake, in that it sounded like you were sort of saying the problem is they don't know how to actually use this evidence to be able to do the kind of science themselves in their own sort of way to be able to come to these kinds of conclusions. I think the danger is that they do respect science. What they don't like is that the science isn't leading them to the conclusions that they want. And I think this is one of the things we have to, that's important in thinking about all of these kinds of issues of, to your point, Claudia, about like, so where did science journalism go wrong? Is that it's not just an issue of science or science journalism. I think that unfortunately, what we're seeing happen with science journalism and these issues about the pandemic and climate and evolution and the rest, is we're also looking at certain sort of larger cultural conflict where there are sort of larger narratives that are sweeping up people and setting some sorts of opinions, and quite frankly, predisposing people to take some kinds of positions. And I think that I would like to credit people to think that if we just, in a sense, did a better job of like helping them put the pieces together in a more scientific way, that they would get to it. I wouldn't swear that there's no value to that, but I think that there are other things that are going on that are driving people to a lot of these conclusions. And science is incidental in some cases to what is at stake in some of the rest of that.
Okay, our business is communication, but maybe let's raise this heretical possibility. To what extent is the scientific community responsible for some of the lack of trust?
I think, as someone who doesn't work for a media company like most people here, but represents the scientists, I think we have an enormous responsibility. And we really felt that when the pandemic started. I mean, the stakes suddenly got so high, and we became very focused on, not just communicating, but basically damage control. We became so aware that, something we might say or write, or something our scientists might say, someone might take and use to, draw their favorite conclusion, or sort of to get to that point. And there were many times, one of our virologists, when they found that you get a better immune response by having COVID than by having a COVID vaccine, we really had to think hard about that. How do we communicate that? How do we make sure that people don't go out and party and try to get infected? And are we, should we really report on this story? And there were actually a number of stories that, if it had been about a different virus or, something else, we might have run them. But there were stories we decided not to do for that reason.
Interesting. You self-censored in essence.
Well, self-centered, or rather, you have to really ask ourselves, what's the benefit? This may be, very, very arcane science. If it's not something that people can clearly understand and know how to relate to, and there's a risk for misinterpretation, it may just not be the right opportunity to feature that person's work.
That science was shared with other scientists, though, no? I mean,
yes.
Okay, so
yeah,
you're saying a more popular communication about the study or whatever. I see.
Exactly. And then, some of our scientists were upset about how they had been portrayed in the media, that it was something they had said, been taken out of context. That could be a reason for us to do a story and try to get it more right, so that at least, there was somewhere where people could learn, the more correct version of what they were saying. And yeah.
Let me ask a question of David Sassoon. Climate change, the issue that got blown out by two big stories, the war or the invasion of Ukraine, and before that, COVID. Was it exceptionally hard to make the issue visible to the general public? Most of the issue till very recently was math models, complicated math models that projected into the future and that were hard for people to see. How do you make that real?
Yeah, well, the climate story has been pushed off the stage over and over again ever since it was being discussed. There was always something, a war or, an economic collapse or something else that would keep pushing it off the stage because it didn't seem immediate. I think what the scientists said 30 years ago is coming to pass, that we're seeing the signals and we can see it manifest and it arrived just in time, and we're seeing and experiencing the impacts of climate change. So the physics are relentless and it helps us tell the story. I will say that, coming out of the pandemic last year, we too experienced a bump that surprised us. I mean, we started getting 2,000 subscribers a week in 2021, and it's continued, and now it's up to 3,200 a week. So something has happened. There is a enormous hunger out there because we're free and accessible, and we have our work in all kinds of places. I mean, I think they're finding their way to us, but we think that there is an enormous hunger for understanding climate and what can be done about it in a way that we've never experienced before in our 15 years on the job.
Yeah. One of my students asks a question. Let me find it exactly. Marie Lilly, who is a graduate student at Arts and Sciences, asks, how do you write for a broad audience about scientific advancements without oversimplifying the context? And the reason I pick out her question is you always get that from scientists. You journalists, you're oversimplifying. That's why we don't want to talk to you. Well, how do you deal with that? Since Marie Lily wants to know.
My view of this is, I mean, it's always sort of a thing you have to navigate. Is you don't want to talk down to an audience. You want to be respected by people who know what you're writing about, by the experts. But my feeling about this is you can write a story that a scientist or someone in the world of science that would respect doesn't have to be boring. And you can have it both ways. You can have your cake and eat it too. I think everyone, whatever your background, will appreciate journalism that's interesting and compelling, and the challenge is to make it accessible to a broader audience while not oversimplifying it to the expert audience that's going to read it. And I think this is too simple. And I think it's sometimes hard to navigate, but I think it can be done.
So with COVID, it wasn't like climate change, something off in the future or something that could be blamed on something else. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were dying around other Americans, and you could see it. But what we had was this phenomenon of people not seeing what was there. How does one deal with that? Everybody's silent. Maybe it's an unanswerable question. And to me, as a reporter in this field, it was the big shock. The big shock was that the evidence of this calamity was there for everyone to see, and yet it was being denied.
I think fundamentally it comes back to something somebody else said earlier that I don't remember, is part of what we should be doing in addition to just putting the facts out there is explaining the process that gets us to them. And talking about how we know something and not just what we know is the two are equally important. If people are to have any confidence in what we're telling them, the process of science is, what gives, scientists confidence in things, and explaining that should, in theory, help the public understand what numbers they should have confidence in. One of the problems with pandemic coverage in general is that people didn't do a good job of conveying the remaining uncertainty there, because residual uncertainty never goes away in science, really. Right. And that's been an ongoing problem.
I think you're absolutely right. I think part of our obligation as journalists is to write what we know, and as important as what we don't know. And this story all along, there's more that we haven't known than what we know, and we need to be direct and honest with the readers about that. The problem with that is this whole atmosphere and culture that John and David talked about isn't conducive to nuance. People want to know starkly, like, what's going to happen or what's not going to happen, who's on what side. And science is not like that. We're all kind of learning as we go along. And the other challenge is, how do you explain this on, even if you're a credible news organization, how do you explain, say, on the network news in 30 seconds, what the latest twist is in COVID in a way that's fair and and not alarmist? And it's really, there are really a lot of challenges and obstacles here.
Going forward, we now have a situation where people have decided the pandemic's over. I'm done with it. And one of the things we know, thanks to what we know about Darwin and evolution, is that viruses mutate and we may not be done with it. Should we be warning the public and helping them get ready for what may be an astounding disappointment in the fall?
Or even sooner than then. I mean, it might
Yeah,
not be just the fall, it might
or
be
this
like-
new mutation all over Europe might end up coming here. But yet I took 3 taxis yesterday till I could get into one where the driver wore a mask. And that's a New York City law, they're supposed to. But they're convinced it's done. What do we do with that?
I don't know. Every scientist that works on COVID that I've spoken with believes that, beyond this virus we're dealing with now, there will be more pandemics. I mean, SARS is a thing, it's coming back sooner or later. We don't know when, but so I think, yes, absolutely, there's going to be not one disappointment. There's going to, the world has changed, and people need to know.
And
people don't want to hear that, but
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, there is still an HIV pandemic going on for many years, and like it's not controlled. So, but we have learned to live with it, and there's a lot of scientific advancement with it. So, going back a little bit with what you saw of like how to tell stories of things that we cannot see or are difficult to convey, either pandemic or climate change, I guess it goes to tell the human stories, and how sometimes it's a little bit hard, especially when like the science is new, but just telling the reader how this science will affect them for good or for bad, that always makes them care about it. Talking about climate change, one of the, I guess, the failures, I guess, in communication was, in the early years, when you talked about climate change, you had this image of the polar bear, in the Arctic, just in a piece of ice, and that didn't really convey, what was going on, because you don't have polar bears in the tropics in America. Now we're talking about climate refugees, and that's kind of like, hey, yeah, it's sad what's going on in the Arctic with polar bears, but climate change will affect you in this and that way, floodings, hurricanes, natural disasters, and I think that I don't want to be alarmist, but I guess that having that, landing that science into the human lives goes a long way into having people care and kind of paying attention without, like you said, oversimplifying or overachieving in that front end. But I think always telling the story of people that can be affected, but also the stories of the scientists, how they deal with this is also, I think, really important to tell, to figure out what we know, what we don't know, and how to move forward.
I think you're right about telling the stories, and I think it's an obligation for journalists to give people a visceral sense of people have been dying and what they're going through, and to sort of reach out to people and see what's the impact of this pandemic. And I think a big test for all of us is going to be, as we approach this 1 million death number in the US, is how are different news organizations going to handle it. I for one have always sort of resisted these kind of artificial number like anniversaries. But when you think about it, 1 million people dead, and that's something that we're all trying to grasp still, at least I am. What is 1 million people? How did this happen? And I think we somehow need to use that to break through to the public about the toll this is taking and the implications. And we'll see for years whatever happens with with these variants, the implications of where we are now on human health and the public health are just untold, and mental health and everything for years to come. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what journalists do to sort of capture the public's interest and say, this is an important big story that you have to understand.
But I think also going along with all of that, I think there's that awareness of, we should absolutely look to try to tell what we understand, what the scientists understand as compellingly and convincingly and truthfully as we possibly can. We also, I think, have to also just recognize the limitations of what we have available to us. As a journalist, at any one time, you are telling your one story at a time. Yeah. This is, you can only hope to tell your story as convincingly as possible. If I have to wake up in the morning and, live or die by the idea of, is this the story that's finally convinced everybody to get vaccinated or to do whatever else? Of course, we are then setting ourselves up for failure. We have to try to tell these things correctly, and we have to hope collectively that we get in place. But again, I think this is where what's shaping that collective goes way beyond what we as journalists are doing. Right. Talk about how science is involved in people's lives in every possible way. The way that the attitudes we have toward the science are shaped by countless things beyond science journalism or what scientists are saying. They are shaped by, what your cab driver is doing and whether or not you have a job and, what all the other people on your street are doing or the people in your house are doing. You can hope that collectively somehow we are getting toward some sort of critical mass that will shape things the right way. But individually, you just have to do the best you can with each story as it comes.
I'd also say that we're limited in some ways by how much we know when it comes to the science. Thinking back at the climate change example, one reason early on where there weren't a lot of stories about hurricanes and floods and fires is because the scientists themselves were saying, hey, we don't know how many, we can't really connect it. We don't want to say this, because they were being cautious, because scientists typically are cautious in how they describe their work and how, far out you can sort of predict these things. So it's only been recently that more stories have been coming out saying, yes, the models predict that there will be more and intense wildfires or what have you. And we've been seeing more stories that are connecting those more clearly. Of course, David could talk more about that than I can necessarily. But.
No, that's absolutely right.
That's something the scientists themselves did in response to the fact that the media coverage of these stories the people doing the reporting were often asking this question and they couldn't answer it. So they set up a system that allows for rapid attribution of events now. And now that that's in place, they have an answer within a couple of days for everything.
Well, in the remaining 7 minutes we have, what do you think is the big science story that you want to cover coming up?
With respect to COVID or in general?
Both. I mean, COVID, we can't get away from COVID.
I mean, I think that one lingering question for all of us is long COVID. What is that? What is that? What does it look like? How is it going to affect health across, communities and across the globe? And we don't have a good handle on that yet. And I think it's difficult to report on. And so that's one for me, certainly.
Sure thing. Any other thoughts? Well, I would like to jump in and say I'd like to see people reporting on the whole issue of mutations and possible other variations of what's coming, or the issue that there may be other pandemics coming. But people need to know this so that they don't engage in lemming-like behavior.
Sorry, this is not a story topic, but just a general thing. I feel like it's been very underemphasized that a lot of things went extremely well scientifically during the pandemic. I mean, there were the vaccines that we have, people say they don't work. They are amazing. And the fact that mRNA vaccine technology was ready just in time for this pandemic is just, incredible. It was incredible luck. The fact that there had been people studying related coronaviruses that nobody cared about because SARS was over, MERS was over. But there were virologists who knew that these types of viruses will be coming back, and without that research, we wouldn't know about the spike protein. They wouldn't have been able to develop vaccines and treatment as quickly as they were. And I think there is a bigger story to tell about. I think one reason that it's so hard to connect with readers is that everyone is very afraid and everything seems so uncertain and we can't get answers to the questions we want. But at the same time, there is a sort of more long perspective view, which is that something a scientist learned today can have incredible implications 10 years later, and we don't know what that is. But there's
so one of the basic stories is that basic science worked.
It worked.
Science for its own sake, which many people consider a waste of money, was absolutely not that.
But you can have some trust in it, or that's an option. And I think that's an incredibly important perspective in all of this.
Absolutely. In the remaining couple of moments that we have before we enter the green room, the mythical green room in the ether with students from the seminar, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time and for being so interesting, as science journalists always are, and for a really lively discussion under not so good circumstances. But next time, like next year in Jerusalem, we will be meeting in person, I hope, and we will be having pizza and bad Chianti at J&T Pizzeria. I hope to see you then. And I thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.